He stopped to fix an old man's tire, not knowing he'd just saved a life. It was the kind of road where most people just kept driving. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Jason was heading home after a long shift. The sun had just dipped below the trees, and the stretch of road he was on was quiet. One of those two-lane back roads that wind through small towns and empty fields. No traffic, no houses nearby. Just fences, gravel, and the sound of tires rolling over uneven pavement. He didn't notice the car at first. The hazard lights were dull in the fading light. But as he got closer, he saw the figure standing beside it. An older man, maybe in his 70s, hunched over slightly, staring at a flat rear tire. The man looked tired, not just from the situation, but in a way that had been building for a long time. Jason passed the car. Not fast, but enough to make that first decision. The one most people make when they see someone broken down. Keep going. Someone else will stop. He's probably already called for help. But a few seconds later, he slowed down. Then he turned around. By the time he pulled up behind the car, the man hadn't moved. Still standing in the same place. Still looking at the flat, like it was something too big to deal with on his own. Jason got out and walked toward him. "You need a hand?" The old man looked up slowly. His eyes were pale and tired. He hesitated before nodding once. "I think I've got a spare," he said. "Not sure I've got much else." Jason nodded. "I'll take a look." The trunk was open, and the tools were scattered. Jack, lug wrench, spare tire, everything was there, just not in any order. Jason crouched down, set to work without asking more questions. The pavement was rough under his knees, and the fading light made it harder to see, but he kept going. The old man stood a few feet away, watching. Not pacing, not talking, just watching. Jason didn't mind the silence. It was familiar. He'd grown up helping his dad fix things in the garage. They never talked much either, just passed tools back and forth and got the work done. After about 20 minutes, the spare was on, and the tools were back in the trunk. Jason wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up. "You're good to go," he said. The old man didn't answer right away. He looked at the tire, then back at Jason. "You didn't have to stop." Jason shrugged. "Didn't seem right to just drive by." The man nodded slowly, then said something Jason didn't expect. "You didn't just help me. You stopped something worse from happening." Jason didn't know what to say. The words felt heavy. They didn't match the situation. Just a flat tire on the side of the road. That was all it was. He tried to smile a little. "Well, I'm glad I was here then." The man looked at him for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "So am I." Jason got back into his car. The old man gave a small wave before getting into his own. Neither of them said anything else. As Jason drove away, he kept checking the rearview mirror. The car faded behind him, but the man's words didn't. "You stopped something worse from happening." He didn't know what they meant. Not really. But something told him they weren't just words. They were a truth he hadn't yet seen. Jason couldn't stop thinking about what the man said. "You stopped something worse from happening." The words played over and over in his head as he drove home, even though the road was quiet and the night was calm. There was nothing strange about the situation, at least not on the surface. Just a flat tire. Just a man who needed help. But the way he'd said it, the way his voice sounded like it came from somewhere deeper, it stuck with Jason more than he expected. He pulled into his driveway a little after 9. The porch light was on. His roommate had left it for him. Inside, the house was quiet. Jason dropped his keys in the dish by the door and sat on the edge of the couch. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat there, staring at the floor. He hadn't even asked for the man's name. That bothered him now. Not because it mattered in a formal way, but because people should know who they help. It shouldn't feel like something you just do and forget about. It should mean more than that. He thought about turning around, driving back down that road, but he knew it was too late for that. The man was long gone, maybe already home, maybe halfway across the state. There was no way to know. And yet, Jason couldn't let it go. The next day, at work, he told one of the guys in the shop about it, just in passing, just a quick story while they waited for parts to arrive. "Stopped to help an older guy with a flat last night," Jason said. "He said something weird." "What'd he say?" "Said I stopped something worse from happening." The guy laughed a little. "Maybe he was just being dramatic. You know how people get." Jason gave a small shrug. "Yeah, maybe." But he didn't believe that. Later that night, he drove back down the same road. Not because he thought the man would still be there, but because he wanted to see it again. The spot where he'd pulled over. The place where it happened. He slowed down when he reached it, letting his headlights wash over the gravel shoulder. The spot looked the same. Nothing unusual. No signs left behind. No clue that anything had ever happened there. But it had. Jason sat there for a few minutes with his engine running. Cars passed by occasionally, but no one stopped. No one even slowed down. He thought again about how easily he could have kept driving. How simple it would have been to tell himself it wasn't his problem. But he hadn't. He turned off the car and stepped out, walked to the side of the road and looked around. The air was cooler than the night before. The sky was clear. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, just thinking. There was something else bothering him now, something more than the man's words. It was the way he looked when Jason pulled up, like he wasn't just stranded, like he was stuck in something deeper. He hadn't looked surprised to see someone stop. He'd looked like he didn't expect anyone to. Jason got back in his car and headed home. The road stretched out in front of him like it always did, but now it felt different. He didn't know the whole story. Maybe he never would. But what he did know was this. Sometimes people say more in a few words than they can explain in a lifetime. And sometimes the smallest act of stopping becomes the thing someone else never forgets. It was 3 days later when the letter showed up. Jason was at work, wiping down the front counter, when one of the delivery guys handed it to him. No return address. Just his name, written in shaky handwriting on the front. No stamp either, which meant someone had dropped it off in person. He turned it over in his hands a few times before opening it. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, folded twice. No decoration, no envelope logo. Just a plain sheet, written with the same unsteady hand. It said, "You didn't know it, but you gave me a reason to keep going. Thank you for stopping. George." That was it. No last name. No explanation. Just the same weight in the words that Jason had felt on the side of the road. He read the note again, slower this time. "You gave me a reason to keep going." Jason sat down behind the counter and just stared at the letter. The handwriting wasn't rushed. It looked like someone who had taken their time, like they wanted the words to be the right ones. Simple. Clear. He remembered the man's face, the way he had looked down at the tire, not saying anything at first, the way his hands trembled just a little when Jason had handed him the jack, the way he said that strange sentence, "You stopped something worse from happening," and then got in his car without offering more. Now, it was clearer. Jason folded the letter and placed it inside his wallet. He didn't know why, but it felt right to keep it close. Like it wasn't something you threw away or left in a drawer. It wasn't long, but it carried weight. Later that day, he told his boss he was stepping out for a while. Didn't give a reason. Just said he needed 20 minutes. He drove toward the edge of town. There was a coffee shop by the old post office. A small place, the kind with faded awnings and a few metal tables out front. He'd passed it 100 times, but never stopped. He wasn't sure what made him go there now. He just had a feeling. When he walked in, it smelled like old coffee and sugar. There were a few people inside, a couple of regulars talking softly by the counter, one young guy working on a laptop in the corner. And in the back, by the window, sat the man from the road. Jason stood still for a second. The man, George, was holding a coffee cup with both hands, looking out at nothing in particular. Jason walked over slowly. George looked up as he approached. For a second, he didn't seem to recognize him. Then his expression changed. Just a little. A quiet shift. "You're the one from the road," Jason said. George nodded. "Yeah. I got your note." George didn't say anything. He just looked back down at his cup. Jason sat across from him. They didn't talk for a minute. Just sat there. Two people in a quiet coffee shop, letting the air settle. Then George spoke. "I was on my way to do something I can't take back." Jason didn't move. George didn't explain further. He didn't cry. He didn't get dramatic. He just said it like it was a fact. "And then you stopped," he added. "For no reason." Jason nodded once. It just felt like the right thing. George looked at him. It was. There wasn't much left to say after that. Some stories don't need a long explanation. Some just need someone to listen. And someone to stop. They met again the next day. Jason didn't plan it. He just found himself driving by the same coffee shop after work. Something pulled him back. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, just knew that he wasn't done thinking about it. When he walked in, George was already there. Same table, same seat, same plain coffee cup held in both hands. Jason gave a small nod as he walked by, and George motioned to the empty chair across from him. Neither of them said anything right away. They didn't need to. Jason sat down and rested his arms on the table. The silence was familiar now. Not awkward, just there. George finally looked at him. His eyes were tired, but they didn't look empty. Most people wouldn't have stopped. Jason didn't respond. He just listened. "I stood there for a long time," George continued, "before you came. Just staring at that tire. I kept thinking how easy it would be to let it all go. Just sit down, close my eyes, and not move again." Jason swallowed hard but said nothing. George went on, slow and steady. "When you pulled up, I didn't want to be helped. Not at first. I thought it would just delay the same thing. But then you got out, didn't ask much, just started working." Jason nodded a little. Didn't seem like it needed a big conversation. George gave a small breath that was almost a laugh. No, it didn't. They sat like that for a few more minutes. The coffee shop buzzed gently in the background. A machine steamed milk behind the counter. A song played low over the speakers. Nothing important, nothing loud. George looked out the window. "My wife passed 2 years ago. Cancer. She was everything to me. After that, I didn't have much left." Jason looked down at the table, giving him space to say whatever he needed. "No kids, no family nearby. Most of the time the house is quiet. I don't think anyone's knocked on my door in over a year." He paused. "I guess I started to believe I wouldn't be missed." Jason leaned forward slightly. "But you were wrong." George looked at him. Jason didn't say it like he was trying to fix anything. He just said it like it was the truth. George didn't respond right away. Then he gave a small nod. I think you might be right. They didn't talk about it more than that. They didn't need to. Jason stayed until George finished his coffee. They said goodbye without any promises. No plan to meet again. Just a quiet understanding that maybe this wasn't the end of the story. That night, Jason drove home thinking about how close everything had come to being different. One moment. One decision. That's all it took. He thought about what would have happened if he hadn't stopped. If he'd kept driving. If he'd made the excuse that someone else would help. But he didn't. And now, a man who had almost disappeared from the world was sitting by a window, drinking a cup of coffee, and talking again. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not a speech, not a miracle, just a few minutes. Just enough time to remind someone that they still matter. Jason didn't tell anyone about the coffee shop, or the letter, or the conversation. Some stories aren't meant to be retold. They're meant to be remembered. The next time Jason walked into the coffee shop, George was already waiting with a second cup. It caught him off guard. He hadn't said he'd be back. They hadn't made plans. But the cup was there on the table, steam rising slowly in the space between them, as if George had known he would come. Jason sat down. You didn't have to, he said, nodding toward the coffee. George gave a small shrug. Didn't seem right not to. They didn't say much at first. The kind of quiet that comes from people who have already said the most important things and don't feel pressure to fill the space with more. They sat and sipped, watching cars roll by outside the window. After a while, George leaned back in his chair. I've been coming here for years, he said. Always sat in the same spot. Never really talked to anyone. Just watched. Jason nodded. Why here? Felt like somewhere I could be around people without having to be part of anything. You know? Jason did know. More than he expected. George tapped his fingers lightly on the side of his cup. After she passed, I stopped going most places. Grocery store once a week. This place when I didn't want to sit in silence at home. That's about it. He looked down at the table for a second, then back up. But it's different now. Jason raised an eyebrow. George gave the slightest smile. Now when I come in, I look for someone. Doesn't matter if you show up or not. Just the idea that you might. Jason didn't say anything. He just let that settle. George wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't looking for help or advice. He just needed someone to sit across from him every once in a while. Someone to remind him he was still here. Jason thought back to that night on the road, the way George had looked standing next to the flat tire. How heavy he looked, like the air itself was too much to hold up. And how different he seemed now. Still quiet, still tired, but not gone. You doing okay? Jason asked. George nodded slowly. Better than I was. That was all. It wasn't some big turnaround, not a transformation, but it was something. Jason stayed a little longer that day. They talked about small things, old cars, the town changing, places that used to be open and weren't anymore. It wasn't deep, it wasn't heavy, but it mattered. When Jason finally stood to leave, George reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I don't know if this means anything, he said, but I started writing again. Jason took the paper and unfolded it. A short paragraph. A memory about the first time George met his wife. Just a few lines. Simple and honest. I used to write stories, George said. Little ones. For her. Stopped after she passed. Jason looked up. Why'd you start again? George paused, then said, Because I didn't feel invisible anymore. Jason nodded and tucked the paper into his jacket pocket. As he walked out, he glanced back through the window. George was still sitting there watching the street, but he looked lighter now. Not in body, but in the way he sat, like something had eased. Jason didn't tell anyone about the paper, or the second cup of coffee, or the story George had written down just to say he still could. He just kept showing up. Because sometimes the simplest thing you can do for someone is remind them they're still seen. And sometimes that's enough to bring them back. Jason didn't expect anyone to notice the change, but people did. His coworker mentioned he seemed quieter lately. Not in a bad way, just more focused. His roommate asked if something was going on, not out of concern, just curiosity. Jason didn't give much of an answer. He wasn't sure how to explain it. He had just started seeing things a little differently. It had been 2 weeks since the flat tire. 2 weeks since he pulled over on the side of that road and met a man who barely had the strength to keep going. Now, most days after work, he found himself driving by the coffee shop without thinking. Some days George was there. Some days he wasn't. But Jason went anyway. Sometimes they sat in silence. Other times they talked. George didn't always open up, but when he did, it was steady and honest. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced. Just small pieces of a life he hadn't shared in a long time. One afternoon, George told Jason about the job he used to have. 30 years at a hardware store just a few blocks from where they were sitting. Said he liked working with his hands. Said he missed the routine. He talked about how, after his wife died, he tried going back, but it didn't feel the same. Said the store had changed, but really, it was him that had changed. Jason listened, like always. He was starting to understand something. George didn't need advice. He didn't want solutions. He just needed space to say things out loud to someone who wouldn't walk away. That day, after they talked, Jason left the coffee shop and drove back toward home. On the way, he passed the road where it all started. He slowed the car as he approached the spot, then pulled over. Just for a minute. The shoulder was empty now. No broken-down cars. No figure standing beside the tire. But Jason got out anyway. He stood there in the same spot where George had been standing that night, looked around, took a deep breath. He remembered the sound of the gravel under his shoes, the way George had looked up at him without saying anything, the way the sky had started to darken, and the air had felt too still. It didn't look like much now. Just a curve in the road that most people wouldn't think twice about. But for Jason, it was the place where everything changed. He stayed for a few minutes, then got back in the car and drove home. Didn't say anything about it to anyone, just carried it with him. Later that week, he walked into the coffee shop and saw something different. George wasn't alone. He was sitting at his usual table, but this time, he was talking to someone else. A woman about his age, holding a book in one hand and a paper cup in the other. They were laughing softly about something. Jason didn't interrupt. He just nodded when George looked up. George smiled. Not big, not forced. Just a simple, honest smile. Jason ordered a coffee and sat near the window. He didn't need to be at the table that day. It wasn't about that. What mattered was that George was still here, still showing up, still finding reasons to speak and connect and keep going. And all because of one night, one stop, one small decision to pull over when it would have been easier not to. Jason didn't say a word as he watched them talk. He just sat there, quiet, knowing what the moment meant, even if no one else did. Sometimes saving a life doesn't look like a rescue. Sometimes it just looks like being there. Jason didn't expect George to bring it up again. They had already talked about it once, briefly, carefully. That night in the coffee shop when George admitted where he was going, what he was planning. Jason had never asked for more. He figured if George wanted to say anything else, he would. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Rain had been coming down off and on all day. Jason walked into the coffee shop, shook the water from his jacket, and found George already sitting at their usual table. A cup of coffee in front of him, a folded napkin resting under his fingertips. Jason sat down and pulled the chair a little closer. George didn't say much at first, just nodded in his direction. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table between them. A small black and white photo, old and creased. A younger version of George, standing next to a woman with dark hair and a kind face. They looked happy. Not staged, not posed. Just real. "My wife," George said. "Her name was Helen." Jason leaned in to get a better look. "She used to say that life isn't about what you build," George said. "It's about who you show up for." He paused, eyes still on the photo. "That night," he said quietly, "I thought I was done showing up." Jason didn't interrupt. George kept going. "I had been carrying it around for months. The feeling that nothing I did mattered. That nobody would notice if I just stopped being here. I didn't talk about it because I didn't think anyone would understand." He looked at Jason then. Really looked. "And I didn't tell you that night because I wasn't ready to say it out loud." Jason nodded, steady and patient. George's voice didn't shake. It wasn't dramatic, just calm, just real. "I'd written a note, left it on the kitchen table. I had planned everything, and then that tire went flat, and you stopped, just like that." Jason didn't know what to say. There wasn't a script for something like this. "I remember thinking, why now?" George continued. "Why would anyone stop for me now, when I'd spent months believing no one saw me?" He leaned back in his chair. "But you did." Jason finally spoke, voice low. "I didn't know any of that." "I know," George said. "That's the point. You didn't know. You just showed up anyway." They sat in silence again. Outside, the rain hit the windows softly. Inside, the shop felt warm, steady, familiar. Jason looked at the photo again. "She looks kind," he said. She was. George tucked the photo back into his pocket. "She'd have liked you." Jason didn't respond. He just nodded. Before they stood to leave, George said one more thing. "I don't expect you to understand what that night really meant to me, but I need you to know it didn't just change my plans. It changed how I see everything now." Jason looked him in the eye. "I believe you." And he did. Because sometimes people don't need someone to carry the weight for them. They just need someone to stand still long enough so they can catch their breath. And that night, on the side of the road, that's exactly what Jason had done. George started coming in earlier. Jason noticed it first on a Thursday. He walked into the coffee shop around 5, expecting to see George settling into their usual spot. But George was already there, halfway through a cup of coffee, reading the newspaper. It happened again the next time, and the time after that. One day Jason asked, "You changing your routine?" George gave a small smile. "I guess you could say that." He didn't offer more, but Jason could tell. Something had shifted, not in a big dramatic way, just in small choices. George was showing up earlier, staying longer. Some days he chatted with the barista. Some days he brought a book. A few times Jason saw him talking to other customers, even if just for a minute or two. It was like watching someone remember how to live again. Slowly, carefully, but fully. Jason didn't try to guide it. He just kept showing up. They still sat together most days. They talked about small things, weather, traffic, old memories. George shared more now. Not everything, but enough. He talked about Helen more often, like her memory didn't hurt quite the same way anymore. She liked mornings, he said one day. Said they were quiet enough to think and loud enough to feel like something might happen. Jason smiled. Sounds like she made things better. She did. They sipped their coffee in silence for a while after that. Later that week, George brought something new with him. It was a small notebook, the kind you could buy for a couple of dollars. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Jason. "I've been writing again," he said. "Figured it was time." Jason opened the notebook. Inside were short entries, some just a few lines, others a paragraph or two, observations, memories, moments. One entry read, "Saw a boy with his dad outside the grocery store. The kid laughed at something small. I remembered what it felt like to laugh without needing a reason." Another read, "The coffee tasted better today. I think it's the company." Jason looked up. "This is good." "It's something," George said. "I don't know where it's going. Just feels like it matters." Jason handed it back. "Keep going." George nodded. It wasn't about being published. It wasn't about sharing it with the world. It was just about showing up to the page, finding a way to keep his thoughts moving forward instead of in circles. The next day, George wasn't at the coffee shop when Jason arrived. For a second, Jason felt something tighten in his chest, a small flicker of worry. But then he saw George walking up the sidewalk outside, a paper bag in one hand, a smile on his face. "Brought muffins," he said. "Figured we should start acting like we know each other." Jason laughed. "Took you long enough." They sat down, opened the bag, and split the muffins. It wasn't anything big. Just another small moment between two people who, not long ago, were strangers on opposite sides of a broken night. But now, they weren't strangers. They were just two people who had chosen to keep showing up. Jason didn't say it out loud, but he knew what was happening. George was rebuilding. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to matter, enough to keep going. Jason never told anyone the full story. When people asked why he stopped that night, he always gave the same answer. Said he saw a guy with a flat tire and figured it was the right thing to do. That was it. Nothing more. Most people nodded and moved on. Some said it was good of him. Some said they would have done the same. No one asked what came after. He never brought it up. Because the truth wasn't something you told to fill space. It was something you carried. George still came to the coffee shop. Not every day, but often. He didn't sit in the corner like he used to. He moved around now, talked to people, learned names. Sometimes even stayed long enough to run out of coffee and get a second cup. One afternoon, Jason walked in and saw George showing the barista his notebook. They were both laughing about something on the page. It was a small thing, but Jason felt it in his chest. The quiet kind of pride you don't talk about. Later, when they were sitting together, George looked out the window and said, "You ever think about how close something can come to going the other way?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, I do." George didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. They both knew what he meant. It had been over a month since that night. Since Jason pulled over without knowing who he was helping. Since he stood on the shoulder of that road, tightening lug nuts on a spare tire while a man beside him was holding more weight than he let on. He thought about it sometimes. Not the tire or the tools, but the moment. The choice. He could have kept driving, could have told himself it wasn't his problem. But he didn't. And that one small decision had shifted everything. He didn't save George in the way people usually talk about saving someone. There was no grand rescue, no dramatic ending, just a quiet interruption. A small act of kindness that said, "I see you. You matter." That was enough. More than enough. As the days went on, Jason realized something else too. George had helped him in a way he hadn't expected, made him slow down, made him see people a little more clearly, made him remember that the smallest actions, offering a hand, sharing a seat, listening without needing to fix, those things still held weight. One evening, just before closing, George handed Jason a page torn from his notebook. Jason unfolded it and read the short paragraph. The man who stopped didn't know he was saving a life. He thought he was changing a tire, but he reminded me that people still care, that strangers can become anchors, that sometimes all we need is one person to show up. Jason folded the paper and put it in his wallet, next to the first note George had written. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, and George nodded back. They left the coffee shop together that night, walked out into the cooling air, and stood by their cars for a moment. "Take care, George," Jason said. "You too." There was no big goodbye, no final moment, just two people who had crossed paths at the right time. Jason got in his car and drove home, passing the stretch of road where it all began. He didn't slow down this time. He just looked once in the mirror. The spot was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like something had happened there, something real, and that would never leave him. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.